One of the reasons why Berserk is such a popular manga series is the fact that Kentaro Miura is a master of the show-don't-tell technique of storytelling. Sure, the violence and depravity have brought the community a section of fans who just appreciate it for its gore factor, but the fact that Berserk is a manga and not a novel is what makes Miura's artwork such an important part of the narrative. As a master of the pen, both in the literary realm and the artistic realm, he could convey information by simply drawing a distressed face and letting you realize what that character is feeling at the moment, which is why it makes complete sense that Berserk's biggest mystery is a character who doesn't even have a face to begin with. The enigmatic Skull Knight first appeared in chapter 37 of the manga, released all the way back in 1994, and nearly 30 years later, people are still not quite sure who he is supposed to be. But that's where we come in. So without further ado, this is the Skull Knight's origins explored. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. He shows up as a harbinger of fate, Skull Knight's first appearance in Berserk. You know, in retrospect, Guts should have known that nothing would be quite the same for him after fighting and surviving against a force as powerful as Nosferatu Zod. And if you're wondering who that is, just go check out our video on him. But it was the night after Guts defeats Griffith and departs from the Band of the Falcon that the Skeletal Oracle first shows himself to our protagonist. And, from the outset, he lets us know that he isn't exactly the hold-your-hand type of guide. Chapter 37 of the manga, simply titled Skull Knight, or Knight of Skeleton for those of you who got the Dark Horse version, opens with Guts spending his first night truly alone in the woods away from the comrades he had made over the last 3 years. The wandering swordsman ruminates about his time as the raider captain of the Band of the Falcon and wonders whether he was yet again walking away from an irreplaceable thing. Though he has fought and lived through countless horrific battles by now, somehow the prospect of spending a night by himself in the woods scares him. The reason for his uneasiness becomes clear when he senses a presence other than his own at his little campsite. The full moon was shining brightly in the sky when Guts felt a bloodlust that paralyzed him on the spot. For a moment, he thought it was Zod again, because the last time he felt such an immense feeling of terror was in the Immortal One's presence. He flips his lid and swings in the direction he thinks his opponent is standing, but misses, to his utter bewilderment. Guts had lived his entire life by the sword. Not once had he mistaken an enemy's position in all of that time. Heck, he had taken down 100 enemies in a single night and defeated the White Falcon himself in single combat. Much of Griffith's accomplishments in the 100-Year War could be attributed to Guts' inhuman aptitude as a swordsman, but now it was as if he was swinging at the wind. As the swordsman gathered his thoughts, a spirit materialized as if from thin air and unnerved him further. But we would imagine watching a dude with glowing red eyes looking like a skeleton who just tried to kill you wouldn't put your mind at ease either. However, the prophecy that he left Guts with becomes the basis for the entire reason Berserk is still going on today. He says that the gears have indeed started to turn, calling Guts a struggler and telling him to take heed. 1 year from that day would be the day of the eclipse, when a torrent of madness and death would sweep over him, his friends, and his unkingly half, most likely referring to Griffith himself. He tells Guts that because he was born from a corpse and nearly died in the mud, he was closer to death than anyone else, which is why he excelled in escaping it. He charges Guts to contend, wriggle, and survive, for only the man who can stand up with a broken sword can resist the eclipse, before he vanishes into the night mist under the full moon and leaving the swordsman wondering about his own fate. Their exchange must have lasted for a couple of minutes at most, but within that time frame, Skull Knight established himself as one of the pivotal characters in Berserk. He not only knew of Guts' birth and its ghastly circumstances, but also accurately predicted that he would survive the eclipse because Guts did indeed stand up to the madness around him with a broken sword in hand. This fact is only further substantiated by every subsequent appearance he makes.
Band of Sacrifice attracts creatures of dark.
A dubious savior and an eternal enemy, Skull Knight's involvement in the eclipse. The next time the Skull Knight appears is a full 15 chapters later when he drives off detouring apostles that fall upon a secondary unit of the Band of the Falcon. Poor Rickert, man. He just went to fetch a pail of water. Just goes to show your fairy tales aren't always what they seem, especially when it comes to Misty Valley elves. After returning to what can only be called a scene straight out of a horror movie, Rickert is saved by the Skull Knight, who drives away the apostles by simply telling them to withdraw and proceed to their feast. He leaves Rickert behind without saying a word and gallops off a tree into the night air, resurfacing outside the site of Griffith's eclipse. This is where we witness a battle between two enemies who are destined to do this forever, Nosferatu Zod and the Skull Knight. Rickert, after surviving the attack on his platoon and receiving elf dust from a wandering puck, witnesses the great battle between the two supernatural beings and instantly recognizes them both. Zod seems to have been waiting for the Skull Knight to appear, recognizing him as an enemy of the Inhumans who has fought against them for a millennium. The skeletal warrior retorts by speculating that Zod was charged with guarding the gate to the interstice, but Zod tells him he has no wish to participate in the nocturnal feast. He only seeks the strong, and on this sacred ground he has come against his old rival once again, who should know that already. Skull Knight muses to himself that Void would say this too was fated by causality, but as a warrior, he wagered himself upon his sword. Surprisingly enough, the same Zod who seemed to be unstoppable and was revered as a god of the battlefield was dispatched by the Skull Knight with ease, who lopped off his arm and galloped into the eclipse. As soon as he broke through the interstice, Skull Knight attacked Void, but his sword was sent back through a spatial portal that directed his blowback to him. Skull Knight easily blocked the attack and locked eyes with Void for a brief moment, before setting off to what seemed to be his task this time around, saving Guts and Casca. To that end, he cut through numerous apostles like a hot knife through butter and easily evaded both attacks sent towards him by the newly made God Hand member Femto. Skull Knight rescued Guts and Casca and escaped the interstice, only to be met by Zod again, who had reattached his arm and was preparing for another assault on his old rival when the warrior did the unexpected. He called for a delay. Zod is about to lose his mind because of losing out on a good battle once more, but he stops himself when he sees why his rival was calling for such a truce. Guts had survived. The apostle was baffled by the idea that a sacrifice would be able to live through the Feast of the Eclipse, but as a warrior, he was enthralled to his last bone. He agreed to Skull Knight's request and even advised him to get away as fast as possible, which the latter does, but not before taking Rickert along for the ride, for this too is connected. The Skull Knight tells the former Falcon that Guts and Casca were not destined to die that day, and to make sure they do get to the day they actually have to die, he brings them to a safe haven that turns out to be near Godot's cottage, the same blacksmith with whom Guts had been living for the year he wasn't with the Band of the Falcon. Turns out a cave near Godot's has elfin enchantments that can keep them safe from what's about to happen to both of them. When Guts sprints out of the cave to try to deal with his trauma, he is surrounded by evil spirits. That's when the Skull Knight shows up once again and warns him that this will be his life from now on. As a branded one, Guts and Casca now reside within the interstice where evil spirits will attack them every day, drawn to their missed sacrifice. He tells the swordsman to steel himself and even gives him his sword to fight off the spirits. Skull Knight bears witness to Guts' declaration of war against demonkind and decides to lend him a hand once again after Guts realizes Casca is in danger too. But when they arrive at the scene, a bizarre event unfolds before their eyes. Casca, who shouldn't have been more than a few weeks pregnant and had a broken mind besides, was in the middle of giving birth to a demon child. Skull Knight immediately realizes that this child is Guts's, but given its current form due to Femto's violation of Casca. As the day breaks, he gives Guts one last warning. When someone whose path ahead is as dark as his, the person must contend with the darkness and envelop themselves in it. But it could also conversely end up consuming that person as well. He wishes his fellow struggler a good journey and disappears into the morning mist once again. The Dread Guide of Death and the Inadvertent Cause of Fantasia. Skull Knight's role as Guardian Spectre. Skull Knight's appearance during the eclipse set up two precedents for his character. 1. His tendency to manifest at the places where evil gathers on a full moon night, most likely, and 2. His eternal blood feud with Nosferatu Zod. But it also tells us that causality is not something only the God Hand can perceive. The Skull Knight also seems to have some perception of the flow of causality, as he is able to most accurately predict what has and what is going to transpire in Guts' life. The only place he has been wrong so far has been in predicting Guts' death, to which even the skeletal spectre admits that the Black Swordsman might be akin to a fish leaping out of a stream in terms of the flow of causality. But these two things are consistent with his future appearances as well, as he mostly shows up at climactic points in any given arc and is somewhat of a hidden trump card for Guts' party. Though Guts himself thinks of the Knight as a bane and harbinger of doom, which, considering the events that unfurl around them, might not be an inaccurate description after all. The next time Skull Knight shows up is during the Conviction arc, where he ingests Rosine's Behelit and saves Luca from the egg-shaped apostle who turns out to be his actual target. Their encounter is short and the apostle is fast, but Skull Knight is able to fatally wound him nonetheless. When the apostle makes his escape, the warrior accepts that this too might be a part of fate, and watches the madness unfold, thinking to himself that all moves as if parallel to that time. Zod approaches him, but the two rivals aren't fated to fight this time around. Skull Knight shows up at Albion after the incarnation ceremony is concluded, and points out Griffith's new physical form to Guts as Zod kneels to his master's incarnated body. He shows up at Flora's before Guts and his party do to inform her of their imminent arrival, and is also the one who charges her with protecting Guts' ego when he inevitably dons the Berserker armor. He gives Guts a way to help restore Casca's mind after his party survives the destruction of Flora's spirit tree by Griffith's apostles. He turns up in Cliffoth when his fellow struggler is, well, struggling to get out of the realm, and uses his awesome sword of Behelits to cut a hole into space itself and rescue Guts from his unfated death. Skull Knight seems to know how most things will play out, and is just as determined as Guts to see the God Hand vanquished, which had caused the swordsman himself to ponder many a time on the similarities that their lives had. After all, Skull Knight was the previous owner of the Berserker armor, and seems to have been struggling against his own fate much like Guts has. He usually makes an appearance only at the most desperate hour of the day, and manages to salvage an unsolvable situation as best as he could, but it is in his last few appearances that we get any idea of his real identity. At least, back when he was a human. See, many characters refer to the Skull Knight as Your Majesty and King in the series, including the God Hand member Slan. He speaks with the air of authority that a king might wield, and has shown valor worthy of a warrior and kindness worthy of a knight. His mere presence has helped stem the tide of evil that is responsible for overtaking the world in the form of Fantasia, even though he was technically responsible for it because of his failed assassination attempt on Femto, but it would be a mistake to think of Skull Knight as anything resembling a human being anymore. He says as much in chapter 362 of the manga, where Guts is made to witness a blood memory seeped into the Berserker armor from its previous owner, aka Skull Knight himself. In that memory, Guts sees what appears to be a dual demonic ritual taking place at the same time. The eclipse Skull Knight witnessed in his lifetime was also an incarnation ceremony, as witnessed by the brand of sacrifice that appears on his dead lover's arm and the ground behind her, before we get a shot of Void alongside 4 other God Hand-like creatures. Guts came out of the experience rattled, thinking that this must have been the eclipse that caused Skull Knight to take up his path. Still, before he could verbalize those thoughts, the skeletal spectre informed Guts what he just saw was the death of a foolish king and the beginning of a dead man stalking the Endless Night. But this is one instance where we actually think the Dark Horse translation fits better. In that English translation, the Skull Knight refers to himself as a wraith, and later, after departing Hanar the Dwarf's dwelling in Skellig, he visits the mausoleum of his beloved, who happens to look an awful lot like the Flower Storm monarch Denon, the same entity who helped Casca regain her mind. Putting all these clues together, we can pretty much guess who the Skull Knight might have been in his human life, but the manga actually implied the answer to this quandary several years ago, and we shall now break down why it makes the most sense. Who is the enigmatic Skull Knight? A mystery unfolded, almost. This might not be a shock to any Berserk fan watching this video, but the Skull Knight hasn't been given a name yet. He is called as such because of the chapter he appeared in, as well as his general appearance. But what might come as a shock to you is the fact that he was actually named in the manga. You just might not have noticed it. This is going to be a controversial take for sure, so take it as you will, but there are major takes on the human identity of the Wraith known as the Skull Knight. The first is this idea that he was someone just like Guts, a warrior who played a key role in a legendary leader's conquest, much like the Black Swordsman was to Griffith. The second is the idea that the Skull Knight was a priest in a former life, one who was subjected to malicious atrocities by that same leader we were referring to in the last sentence. But the third and most prevalent theory, one which has been heavily implied by the late great Miura-san himself, is the one we believe to be the correct answer. In chapter 53 of Berserk, as Guts and his companions descend into the bowels of the Tower of Rebirth with Princess Charlotte in tow, the swordsman asks the heiress to Midland what was at the bottom of the seemingly endless abyss they were staring into. The princess replies with a tale. The tale of the origin of Midland itself. 1,000 years ago, during the Age of the Warlords, humanity was divided into many small nation-states and petty warring kingdoms, until one man united all of mankind under his own banner. No one knew where he came from, or how he came to gather an army as huge as his, but this man managed to conquer the entire continent that humanity resided upon into one empire. He was called many names by legends of those days. The Demon King, the King of Galloping Death, but the one name that fit him the most and endured into modern day in the form of a fairy tale is the name Skull King. When Guts heard of this story the first time, he initially likened this conqueror to Griffith, but when he heard that this king's preferred headgear was a skull-shaped warhelm, he immediately thought of the Skull Knight instead. History only remembers this man as Supreme King Geyserich, and supposedly Princess Charlotte is the last of his line. Now, a similarity in likeness is not proof, we get that, and there is ample room for speculation that Skull Knight was actually a holy man in his previous life. He talks like a priest, but in chapter 138 of Berserk, we hear the tale of an actual holy man who was associated with that supreme king of yesteryear. After performing his daily prostration, Father Mosgus tells a pre-magic Farnese the tale of the Tower of Conviction, the site of the incarnation ceremony where Femto re-entered the physical world as Griffith. Apparently, a millennium ago, King Geyserich had imprisoned a sage there who proclaimed his every sin to God in defiance of traumatizing torture. Mosgus tells Farnese that God heard the priest's cries and sent down angels to destroy the Supreme King's capital city to punish him, for Geyserich's capital had apparently been a den of pleasure and feasting built upon the backs of thousands of workers who went to an early grave. We hear this same story told in chapter 53 as well, but the number of angels that destroy the capital is disputed by Casca and Judo. They are confused whether it was 4 or 5 angels that did the job. A torch falls from one of their party members' hands and drops into the pit beneath the Tower of Rebirth, where Princess Charlotte claims the ruins of Geyserich's old city lie. We see that she wasn't wrong. The city did exist and was indeed buried beneath the tower as part of a cover-up, but the corpses at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth all bore the brand of sacrifice on their heads, which can only mean one thing. The entire city was most likely offered up as a sacrifice to the God Hand. Princess Charlotte also says that the name of Geyserich's old city was actually Midland, which means it's possible that the entirety of the Kingdom of Midland was once part of Geyserich's capital city. A part of the Berserk fandom thinks that the sage who Geyserich locked up has become the Skull Knight, but it makes far more sense that he'd end up being revealed as Skull Knight's true arch-nemesis, Void. See, the priest in question was subjected to things worse than medieval torture. The way Father Mosgus talks about the very act of torture within the context of the Tower of Conviction's torture cells and his inquisitions to deal with heretics makes it seem like that sage's suffering is what personally inspired him to deal out God's justice the way he does. We're just going to be blunt about this next part. Void literally looks like torture incarnate. We don't want to get into the details, but if you can see this guy, then you know what he must have been about in his previous life. The common motif with the God Hand's design that we see is that they're associated with things that are prominent in their minds and bodies at the moment of their deaths. For example, Femto looks like Griffith did with his armor on in his life as a mortal, especially thanks to his beak. But we think that his conception was more inspired by Griffith's torture mask, which was designed to mock his iconic battle helm as well. If Void went out in similar fashion, then it makes complete sense for him to have been the sage that Geyserich imprisoned. So, the Skull Knight being Geyserich's sage is a theory we can safely say we've debunked, just given the amount of precedent there is for his character archetype to ascend and become a part of the God Hand. The idea that Skull Knight could have been someone like Guts, a reliable right hand for King Geyserich, is more plausible given how many parallels exist between their lives. But the thing is, we don't think such an obscure character whose name appears in neither history nor legend could have managed to woo the Lady Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms. And that is where our personal linchpin for Skull Knight actually being King Geyserich lies. In chapter 362, we learn quite a lot about the Skull Knight, such as the fact that his current armor and his former armor, the Berserker armor itself, were made by the same person, Hanar. Skull Knight seems to be acquainted with a lot of people from Elfhelm, like Flora, Guru Gedfring, and Hanar, whom he thanks for his current good health. But it's the blood memory that Guts sees that makes it all fall into place for us. In that memory, we see the Skull Knight's POV as he has cut a bloody path through many apostles, but lies at a gigantic interstice with the literal abyss looming in the background, something that didn't even happen during Griffith's ascension. We see the Skull Knight holding a woman who looks quite a bit like Danon in his arms, her right shoulder bearing the brand of sacrifice, her eyes looking lifeless. We see a much bigger brand of sacrifice appear on the very land they stood on, burning, before we caught a glimpse of Void standing in front of 4 other beings who looked quite suited to be members of the God Hand. Were they members of a previous God Hand? Were they simply superpowered apostles like Locus, Grunbeld, and the others? That is a question for another day, but there is no mistaking what transpired there. An eclipse and an incarnation ceremony took place at the same time, and during that ceremony, Void was evidently born as the first member of the God Hand we know today. If the sage that Geyserich imprisoned was anything like the egg-shaped apostle from the Conviction arc, then he must have possessed a Crimson Behelit and carried a similar dream. What makes him different is the fact that the sage knew the people of Geyserich's empire, and so it makes sense that if he came to view the entire world he lived in as sinful, then everyone living in it would instantly become sacrifices for his eclipse, regardless of whether they knew him or not. We tend to think that the brand of sacrifice is bestowed to the closest loved ones of a person, but that isn't necessarily the case. Griffith is living proof that sacrificing family or love isn't what is important for ascending. It is sacrificing the one treasured emotional connection that still tethers you to your humanity. He openly proclaimed to Princess Charlotte that he doesn't consider the Band of the Falcon's members to be his friends, and showed no hesitation in giving them up when he was reaffirmed in his decisions and his dream. To him, Guts was so hated in that final moment before he activated his Behelit because he took that dream from him. Granted, that is a terrible reason for anyone to turn on what is very clearly your best friend in the entire world, and it makes Griffith and Guts quite similar to Ryo and Akira from Devilman Crybaby, but it is what he thought was wrong with his entire world in that moment. That spilled over into him sacrificing the greatest tools he had used on his journey so far, the Band of the Falcon, and he was rewarded with the stature of becoming a demon amongst demons. If the sage cared for the citizens of Geyserich's old empire from the bottom of his heart and viewed them as essential to his own continued existence, then it would make sense why they were sacrificed. After departing from Hanar's place, Skull Knight visits his beloved's mausoleum in Elfhelm as if on instinct, but it is a magic user he meets during the series that also partially reveals his true identity. The witch Flora looks at Skull Knight fondly, as an old and dear friend, and he too fights to protect her when Griffith's apostles arrive. But after reaching Elfhelm, we learn that Flora used to be a disciple of the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossoms, much like Shirke was her own protege. She was banished from the island because she did something taboo, which is why Shirke had to learn magic in the outside world. Many fans have wondered what it might have been that Flora did which caused her to get banished from her home. But the answer, ladies and gentlemen, surprisingly lies with the most comedic character in Berserk in our opinion, and that is Puck. When Puck meets the Skull Knight for the first time, he wonders to himself that the skeletal specter feels like an elf. We know from the Black Swordsman party's arrival to Elfhelm that witches can use sacrifice spirits to make wicker men, who can be sent out to defend the Isle of Skellig in times of grave danger. We also know that Danon looks a lot like the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossoms, and the brief moment she shares with Skull Knight seems like two lovers who forgot each other due to the sands of time recalling a memory as faint as a star on a cloudy night. So what does all this mean for Skull Knight's identity? Well, we imagine it going a little something like this. When Geiserich lived, the three worlds of Berserk, astral, physical, and ideal, used to be one entity. And so him having known and loved someone like the Lady Priestess isn't entirely out of the realm of possibility. Neither is the fact that he might have brought her with him when he shifted to his large capital city. Flora, who was a disciple at the time, must have grown quite close as a friend with the king, just how Shirke is with Guts. And she could have also been the person who controlled Geiserich in his Berserker mode because, remember, Geiserich was the previous owner of the Berserker armor, and if Hanar is to be believed, he had mastered it fully, unlike Guts. It would make sense that Geiserich was called a Demon King if he wore that armor on the regular battlefield, because if anyone normal saw Guts fight with that thing on, they'd think the same thing. After Void made his sacrifice, Geiserich and his lover were both most likely branded by the brand of sacrifice. Only he survived, thanks to the armor. But not for too long, because Skull Knight is obviously not human, and it is in the Dark Horse translation that we might find the answer to Flora's rule breaking. A wraith is the spiritual likeness of a person, as witnessed just before or after the moment of death. If Geiserich believed in the Berserker armor, which is stated that he did, it makes sense that his ghost would live on as his Beast of Darkness, aka a metal-as-hell goth skeleton warrior. The reason why he feels like an elf is because Flora might have used elfin magic to ensure Geiserich's continued survival as a struggle against fate, fueled solely by love, hatred, and insatiable rage. This process also gave Geiserich a degree of insight into the inner workings of causality, though he seems to interpret its flow more based on observation than intuition. It's also possible that she used some part of the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossom's flesh, as people have speculated that Flora did a reincarnation ceremony for her lost mistress, the result of which was Danon. Gedfring confirms that Griffith's Falconia is built upon Geiserich's old city, with several avian-themed improvements. And there is the fact that everyone who has known the Skull Knight for long enough always addresses him as royalty. The fact that Skull Knight says that he was a foolish king before becoming the wraith he is should honestly be all the confirmation you guys need. Skull Knight was the ancient supreme king Geiserich. Using the power of magic and most likely the Berserker armor, he was able to unite humanity under a single empire. But after that, his morality slipped into evil, which caused Void to sacrifice his entire city to become a God Hand member and sink it to the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth. Now, the Skull King stalks the Knight, looking to right his wrongs vicariously through the journey of Guts. Where Skull Knight failed to save his loved one, he ensures Casca survives alongside Guts. Where Skull Knight failed to kill Zod definitively, Guts seems primed to be the bane of the immortal god of the battlefield. Zod even flat out compares Guts to Skull Knight when he sees him in the Berserker armor. And at this point, if you don't get what we're trying to say, then we really don't know what else we can tell you. Point is, Skull Knight is actually King Geiserich, and we think we've laid out his origins for you rather plainly. He was created as a Stalker of the Night after he lost his life to the Berserker armor, and was transformed into his current state, where he strives only for the destruction of the Inhumans.
Steel yourself.
Marvelous Videos. With Murasan gone and his successor Koji Mori stating he would not like to fill in any gaps left in the story his friend told him to the end with his own words, we don't know if we will ever get a definitive answer as to who Skull Knight is, but we think all the evidence points in a rather conclusive direction. It would make complete sense for King Geiserich, completely drowning in his own hedonism, to inadvertently condemn his kingdom to a grisly fate at the hand of Sage Void, and label himself as a foolish king for it in retrospect. He was at Elfhelm moments before the Moonlight Boy showed up and transformed into Griffith, but as a physical vortex is engulfing Roderick Seahorse, he is nowhere to be found. When will he show up again? Will we ever know who he truly is? How will the Skull Knight story end in Berserk? These answers we're going to have to be patient for. Well, except for the second one. As always, if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. This has been Corey Whelan for Marvelous Videos. Have a good one, be safe out there, and thanks for watching.
Can't slip away. And you were given the order to guard the gate.